My name is Professor Chris Alden. I'm the director of LSE IDEAS. I also hold a chair or professorship here in the International Relations Department. LSE IDEAS, as you may know, is a foreign policy think tank, but we take a very ecumenical view of what foreign policy is under these circumstances. We are interested in the changing global environment, the political economy of change, issues that are transnational in character. I'm thinking, of course, on issues such as climate change and the subset of the topic we're dealing with today, which is on supply lines, critical minerals, and what the implications of a world in motion, such as it is today, and the entry point of geopolitics in particular. So I'm very excited about our talk today, and I just wanted to introduce our guests, Professor Sofia Kalantzakos, who is at New York University in Abu Dhabi, and has been long involved in rare earths and critical mineral questions. She's a distinguished professor in environmental study and public policy, as I said, at NYU, and focuses on the very topics about which we're discussing: geopolitics of critical minerals, the transition to net zero future in the fourth industrial revolution. She's been looking at China's global aspirations on the Belt and Road Initiative, the ecological civilization, if you're familiar with that phrase in the Chinese lexicon, Europe's role in both of these areas as a normative and economic power, and her publications, of which there are many. The one I will highlight is Critical Minerals, Climate Crisis, and the Tech Imperium. So she will be speaking first, and I will also introduce our other speaker, Dr. Philip Andrews Speed, who's a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and the China Energy Program in particular. He's been involved in the energy sector for over 40 years and has indeed started working in the practical tasks of petroleum and mineral extraction as a geologist before entering the more policy-oriented domain. His book with Sufang Zhang, China as a Global Clean Energy Champion, Lifting the Veil, was the recipient of an award for Best International Energy Economic Book by the International Association of Energy Economics. And as I said, this is an opportunity for us to explore these issues, the geopolitics dimension, in some detail. This is one of a number of a series of lectures we're going to have on geopolitics and climate change. So without further ado, if I can ask Sophia to speak, and 15 or so minutes, and then similarly afterwards for Philip, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion and then open it up to the audience.
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be in London. I haven't been here for so many years, and it's still vibrant and super exciting. And I'm really happy to be here and share some of these thoughts with you, because the reality is critical minerals and rare earths and other critical minerals are all the rage now, something that no one had ever heard about. So in 2017, I published a book called China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths with Oxford University Press. And I told a story about these little-known materials, rare earths that are not even so rare, that are indispensable for the future of high tech, the green transition, and defense. China controlled at the time 98% of their production and the supply chain from mine to market. Now, why did they intrigue me? It all started with the trawler incident in 2010 between China and Japan in the waters of the contested by China Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. When Japan refused to release the Chinese captain, there was a short-lived and unofficial embargo of these rare earth elements to Japan. So, big deal, you might say. But it was a big deal, because China used economic statecraft to leverage a geopolitical dispute And the major industrial powers, starting with Japan, realized at that moment that globalization that had ensured uninterrupted access to trade flows and favored fragmented supply chains may not be as secure if the geopolitics were to change. Now, the incident drew a lot of attention. The West huffed, it puffed as rare earth prices skyrocketed. And OECD countries realized that major industrial sectors that needed rare earths were entirely reliant on China. What I found out, however, was that in the end, nothing really changed. As soon as prices corrected, countries moved on to the next crisis. So this story, on its face, seems simple, but there's a lot of unappreciated nuance around it. So first, even before this trawler incident, China had begun to warn the West that it was cutting its rare earth exports. It introduced export quotas a few months before this incident, by which it halved the amounts allowed to leave the country, so 45–50% down. China wanted to address the immense environmental problems caused by extraction and processing, because there was very unregulated extraction, small mines, there was a lot of feed that was leaving the country illegally, there was leaching. So they wanted to really, and it caused tremendous environmental problems, and they published a very important white paper about the environmental repercussions. But they also wanted to consolidate production and use the materials domestically. China's competitors eventually went to the WTO and won the case. But China had already achieved what it wanted: to add value to its economy, consolidate the rare earth industry, and be absolutely ready for the two seismic economic shifts that had been globally decided after the 2015 Paris Agreement. What are these shifts? Decarbonization, i.e. the electrification of transport, and the scaling up of renewables to allow for the dwindling of fossil fuels and the reduction of emissions. And digitalization of the global economy to dematerialize growth and thus respond to the climate crisis. Two shifts, climate was the main focus. Now, those were the facts. And I wondered, how is it possible that the world is embarking on such huge industrial shifts, and those who are the standard producers have completely dropped the ball and not ensured that they have secure supplies and supply chains in order to power the transition? How is that even possible? So when I asked, how could China's competitors be so short-sighted, insinuating that the rare earth scare would happen again with other materials, because we know that all these technologies are now using the entire periodic table. Economists, pundits, and even some scholars felt that I was exaggerating. Now, why did they think I was exaggerating? Because the world still believed that globalization made economic sense and that geopolitics would never trump economics. They were wrong. The United States had been concerned about China's spectacular rise already under the Bush era, George W. Bush era. But the war on terror sidelined efforts to limit China. Eventually, it was the Obama administration that pivoted toward Asia. But it took Donald Trump, whose first administration's modus operandi was to disrupt and engage in direct confrontation, that really ripped off the Band-Aid to designate China as rival number one, a threat to US leadership worldwide. This was a major shift. People were still pretending that nothing really had changed in the world order, China was rising, but China had risen. And it was Trump that really articulated that the time had changed. The trade wars were launched, and the discourse of decoupling from China and stalling China's economic acceleration and influence began to take effect. Now, even in Trump's first term, he focused on rare earths, not relating to the greening of the economy, but for their value for the defense industry. His policies of friction and hyper-competition continued unabated and escalated under the Biden administration. People think that it was just Trump, but Biden really exacerbated the tensions with China. Biden's emphasis on these materials was for the green transition, however, because he meant to create well-paying union jobs and build climate resilience in the U.S. The U.S. enhanced the list of these materials beyond rare earths to include, of course, lithium and cobalt. Many of you know this, but also other inputs like gallium, germanium, indium, graphite, nickel, and copper that were also important for the fourth industrial revolution. Biden sought to work with U.S. allies, and even for him, these transitions were a made in America story. The benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, did not extend to U.S. allies. And that was a source of major friction, especially with the European Union, for instance, right? They were partners, but not partners when it came to actually producing these kinds of applications and technologies. In time, Biden and the US awoke to another huge problem that they had underestimated. China had managed to crack the code of producing green applications that were both high quality and affordable. After all, they had already had supply chains from mine to market that benefited the bottom line of their industry. China had also forged strong ties in the developing world, where a lot of these minerals are located. They rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative and offered alternative financing to Western institutions. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a corridor by which, Eurasia and Africa and looping in South America is happening, right? They also heavily subsidized and invested significantly to leapfrog ahead. In other words, China used every possible tool in their toolbox to make them leapfrog ahead in both of these areas. Compared to China now, the US and the EU could not produce EVs and renewables at competitive prices. So in a panic, tariffs started entering the equation because China could flood the market. They already had the products. All they were pressing like the button and suddenly, all the cars were appearing because they had completely created scale and affordability. So industrial policy came back into fashion, an anathema in the West, and especially in the United States. And ties of interdependence began to sever. Ties of interdependence were the backbone of this whole system of globalization. Now, the race for critical minerals started, but for China's competitors, securing access was to be achieved through cooperation and partnership with the developing world. Moreover, the US, that asked the EU, Korea, and Japan for support, sought ways to delay China's strides in AI and digital infrastructure. Washington realized that Beijing was much farther ahead than originally estimated. The writing was on the wall. It had been clear for so long. But OECD governments refused to acknowledge that the world had changed and that there were other major regional players rising rapidly. And China, of course, was top. Then Trump came back into office. So we're living in very interesting times. He left the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization. He aggressively hit China with huge tariffs to get the ball rolling. And he pitted the US against allies and rivals alike. He turned access to critical minerals into a colonialist-style discourse, transactional and rather exploitative. He talked about buying or taking over Greenland. and signed a minerals agreement to stay engaged in Ukraine, although peace has been very elusive. We still don't have a deal. Smoke and mirrors. Smoke and mirrors. But it showed that the race for critical minerals was turning into a scramble. However, it also showed that this was meant as a distraction. And I think we should think about this, especially in this context of ideas. Why? Because the US felt compelled to erase the climate priority from all policy domestically, but also push for its deprioritization globally. Why? Because the AI race has proven to be so energy intensive that it is a joke to insist that climate action and AI deployment, let alone crypto, at this frenzied rate can ever be compatible. Not at the moment, not for the foreseeable future. The US administration is no longer greening the US economy. It has scrapped the environment and many regulations pertaining to its protection from the books, and is prioritizing fossil fuel extraction and nuclear energy, declaring what? An energy emergency because of AI. I want to remind everybody in the audience that #1 fossil fuel producer is the United States of America today. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia. It is the US. And the US is claiming that they're in an energy emergency. I'm curious to see, actually, whether all these countries that are hastening to buy US LNG today in order to balance trade flows with the United States will suddenly be told by the US that they will reduce exports to domestically use all the energy needed to power the fourth industrial revolution that is an energy vampire. So where are we today? The US is engaged in policies of aggressive distraction. It must be extremely hard to be a policymaker today. One never knows what will come next. They're now calling the media strategy of constant and disparate headline making flooding the zone. Seeking to not be sandwiched, though, between the US and China, Europe has announced that it will continue with the green transition and embark on the fourth industrial revolution. Now, it is good that Europe is doing this, and both, because frankly, if Europe does not electrify transport, its car companies will soon have no market. It also needs to diversify its energy mix, reduce reliance on gas imports, be it from the US or Russia. China has already gone electric, and increasingly, so are other parts of the world, where megacities are choking from pollution, and EVs are now showing the promise of cleaner air. Now, on the tech front, it's inevitable that the world will continue the fourth industrial revolution. When have we ever stopped doing something, especially when we can? So there's also this goal, and you mentioned my one book that actually mentions the tech imperium. There is this big bet now. Who will control the tech imperium? Who will have the data? Who will have the algorithms? Who will build the space, unify the space, and have control of all of this information and of, our footprint? In this, China is also interested in producing a more energy efficient tech, not only a cheaper one. Now, critical minerals, I'm sure, will remain at the forefront of our discussions. While everyone is still catching up on the issue, we have yet to ask different questions. And inevitably, when I'm interviewed, I'm always asked, how did China do it? How do we circumvent China? How do we catch up with China? How do we beat China? There's this anxiety of do we have enough materials? Where are we going to get them? Will we be able to keep up? But there are these wider questions that I wanted you guys to think about that are really being covered up, but are part of what really is unfolding, a story that's unfolding. So with a big head start, China will maintain its advantage. And frankly, in the past few years, there have been moves to diversify supply chains, develop other partnerships, and build resilience. Now, it takes perseverance, money, policy determination, and clear goals to compete effectively. It does not need to produce conflict. Perhaps the important question about these critical minerals is the material intensity of these transitions that scholars have been writing about for quite some time, actually. Is it a climate solution to transform what's left of the world into a mine pit? What about fragile ecologies and livelihoods in water-poor countries? Will the developing world become once again an extracted geography? Is the colonialist narrative back? We thought we were done with this chapter of history. So first, from a climate perspective, everything we're doing, we need to understand, is additive, because we've always prioritized growing the economy. And industrial production of any sort is our go-to plan. Industry is materially intensive. There are ways, however, to be more just, fair, inclusive, and bold. So environmental social governance standards, ESG, that the EU has excelled in, could help maintain a balance. Figuring out how recurring extreme weather and other climate catastrophes affect the economy is a key issue that central banks want to better understand in order to figure out inflation and monetary policy. Ecological diplomacy, mineral diplomacy, based on closer partnerships with the developing world, to share the know-how and production of new technologies could really make a difference. Checks, balances, ecological standards, and a real conversation about the energy and water needs of this AI revolution are essential. Continuing to monitor and reduce emissions, but also addressing other issues, water, food security, and ecological habitats. It's a complex problem that we face, and we cannot simplify it, zone it, label it, break it down, because it's convenient to our siloed thinking. Everything is interconnected. Certainly, Washington's current approach to climate, mineral security, and supply chains does not favor international collaboration. But the noise emanating from there is so intense that other countries find it hard to think. So it's imperative to reduce the volume. Plan without being distracted by the noise. Keep up the global work on climate, because everyone is already feeling the impact of storms, droughts, fires that year after year destroy livelihoods, ecologies, and as Ursula von der Leyen also mentioned and put it very well, I think, important and valuable assets. This is not just about a forest burning, which is super important, but what do these things represent? What these recurring, every year we have the same exact phenomena that have a huge cost. How many times can you pay for the same storm? The US, the EU, and the UK are China's competitors. That's a given. But they are misguided in thinking that the existential threat is China's rise. It's the climate crisis that we should be worrying about. And the growing belligerence that has us investing in the defense industry to prepare for global war. Those will be our undoing. I think of myself as a pragmatist. That's why I wrote a book that warned China's competitors that they did not have their eye on the ball. Rare earths and other minerals are inputs. They should have been in the trade box. But they have now been elevated to geopolitical tools of hyper-competition and conflict. They should be enablers of cooperation, given the existential threat to the world, which is the climate crisis and its impact. But instead, They're used for beating the drums of war, and we don't even quite know how we got here and how to get out of this predicament. There are many paths forward. Conflict is but one choice, but not the only choice. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about domestic energy consumption and how China has built up its renewable energy. And then secondly, I'm going to address to the critical minerals, which is what we've just been talking about. I've called it the international implication of China's roles in the low-carbon energy transition. Two parts, energy, second part, minerals. Okay, so we've had this massive build-out of non-fossil fuel, electricity generating capacity, hydro, solar, wind, nuclear, and they're also electrifying transport, and you've got a growing amount of green hydrogen. And you may have read in 2020, Xi Jinping pledged to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and be to net zero greenhouse gases by 2060. But energy consumption and fossil fuel consumption are still rising. Okay, so here we have electricity generation mix, and you can get impressed by the renewables, nuclear and hydro. You say that's very good, yes, but coal is still growing. When we look at the primary energy consumption, the renewables look rather less, and the coal, oil and gas looks rather bigger. So in electricity, non-fossil fuels are 35%. In primary energy, non-fossil fuels are 16%. Okay, so in China, everything that looks big is small. All this renewable, yeah, but it's actually quite small in the bigger picture of things. So how do we get that we still got more coal going on? Yeah? Some of us would have thought, who live and work China every day, oh, we'd given up on coal 5 or 6 years ago. But no. Why? What happened? Well, I'm going to go back to the USA and Trump version 1, who started to build tensions with China. And so in November 2019, Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister at the time, gave a speech emphasizing energy security. Then we had 2 summers, 2021, 2022, that were very hot and very dry, which means less hydro, and the lights went out all over China, the hospitals had no electricity, and people were stuck in lifts. And so the government very sensibly said, what do we have a lot of? We have a lot of coal, so we start building more coal mines, producing more coal, and building more coal-fired power stations. Coal, however, coal is not any longer seen as the basis of the power sector or the energy sector. They call it the ballast stone. And that means it's for balancing. Okay, and particularly with all the renewables coming in, intermittent renewables, you need power stations that can react. Now in the West, we use gas, because you can turn gas on and off very easily. In China, they're going to use coal, which is not economic, but they got a lot of it. And so a lot of their new coal-fired power stations, even the old ones, are being fitted so that they can be flexible, both seasonally, week to week, and if necessarily, hour to hour. So that is why they continue to build new coal mines and continue to build new coal-fired power stations and continue to use more coal. But let us return to the renewables and the supply chain for renewables and electric vehicles. How did they get there? Well, it was, as Sophia said, foresight, and we'll come to the minerals later, but it was also, they built the whole supply chain in the country from the ground to the final product, and we'll go more into that in detail. But also, my colleague at the Oxford Institute, Anders Hove, has written a very good paper recently, it's on the website, describing how it also came about because of coordinated and sustained policy from central and local government, technology transfers from abroad, technology and manufacturing clusters. So you've got this huge efficiencies for scaling up and for innovation, and human capital. Lots of very hard-working techies and engineers. So this has not only supported China's own energy transition and manufacturing, but has led to its dominant position in the global supply chain. So it's solving its own problems, although be it not as fast as we would like, with the renewable energy and the electric vehicles, but it's also then able to spread this around the world. And that leads me to the main part of my talk. I'm going to look at supply chains for 3 technologies: lithium-ion batteries, wind turbines, and solar PV. I have 3 charts like that I expect you to remember, having seen them for 1 minute. But just look at the colours. Now, I'm colourblind, so I don't get it very right. Okay, so what I've done, so you go from left to right: raw materials, processed metals, subcomponents, and then components. Okay, and then the different colours are the different concentrations. This is China's share of manufacturing or production of ores, processed metals, and whatever. And what you will notice in this and the other ones is that the main concentration, this is a bit of an exception, is in this bit here. The processing of metals, often brought in from overseas, the subcomponents, and in this case the components, but not every case. Now, you say, gosh, more than 80%, in some of these cases 85, 90%, this is terrible. But a lot of this stuff is used in China. Okay, so this is not the share, China's share of the internationally traded stuff. Okay, so for example, lithium-ion cells that go into the batteries, China has 60% of globally traded lithium-ion cells, but that's still a lot for one country. So lots of red, quite a lot of orange. Okay, notably graphite, anodes, cathodes, electrolytes, lithium-ion cells. If we go to wind turbines, again we see the concentration in these middle 2 columns. Okay, here it's the rare earths. We talked about rare earth ores. Yeah, it's sort of 70% or something. But once you got to the refined metals, it's just below 90% these days. And the permanent magnets, that's the key. It's the permanent magnets that the wind turbines need. Again, that's about 90%. And they go into gearboxes particularly, and generators. And the nacelle is the final bit that sits on the top. In Britain, what do we make? We make the towers and the blades, the things that don't actually move, have moving parts and sophisticated metals in. So again, you can see the same issue, that most things are highly concentrated from China. And this is solar PV. The start is sand. That's easy, yeah. But China has lots of sand, but that's sort of irrelevant. It's the polycrystalline silicon, the cells and the wafers, and the silicon modules. Okay, which then we assemble. We just put a metal frame around it, stick it on a roof. And the solar PV, they provide 80% of globally traded PV modules. And I forgot to go back. They provide 60% of globally traded permanent magnets, 85% of globally traded refined rare earths. So this is really filling in what Sophia was saying, that China is a major player not just in rare earths, but in other metals, processed metals, subcomponents, and components that go into your car or your wind turbine or the panel on your roof. As well, as mentioned by Sophia, China's companies are expanding around the world, particularly mining, but also processing and gradually manufacturing, particularly batteries for electric vehicles and the vehicles themselves. And this is great. It gives the world all this stuff, pretty reliable, fairly cheap. It's wonderful. Except if you're in an industrialized nation. And you aspire to, or did once, or still do, make this stuff, because you're being undercut. Thus all the tension and tariffs that Sophia mentioned. But what I want to talk about, and Sophia mentioned, is the risks to supplies. Because this was picked up in 2010, 11, 12. I was in Washington at the time, so I was aware of it. I reviewed Sophia's book positively, as I remember. So what are the risks with China supplying all this stuff? One is unintentional disruptions. COVID, another one of these. Natural disasters, earthquakes in China wipe out cities and everybody's doing something else. Fires in factories. So there's lots of unintentional stuff that can disrupt these supply chains. And then there's the intentional stuff. There's the economic statecraft that Sophia mentioned, which is where they target a particular country, like Japan 13 years ago, but that, of course, was also affected everybody. But I think what is relevant today is export controls, general export controls. So this is stolen. There was testimony to the US-China Economic Security Review Commission a couple of weeks ago, and everything's online. It's very good. And Corey Coombs gave testimony, and here we are. So this is recent history, not ancient history. So they brought in 2020 an export control law that gave a legal foundation. And then they started bringing in, and I've tried to distinguish between restrictions and bans, okay? Most of them are restrictions. And what that means is there's a lot of paperwork to be done before you can export these metals, okay? It's not saying it's not allowed, it's not a quota, it's just saying you've got to go through a big process. They did in 2023 ban the export of rare earth processing equipment. Yeah, because we can dig up rare earths in lots of places. Processing it is a very complex, dirty, dangerous occupation, okay? And it takes a lot of time to build the expertise or even to get the social license to operate, to build one of these plants, because the rare earth ones are not very nice. Dual-use item export regulations. Dual-use means civil military. A few months ago, they banned the export of gallium, germanium, and graphite, which have energy and military uses. Then they brought in exports restrictions on these, and then restrictions on exports of 7 rare earths, which supposedly the restrictions were suspended on the 12th of May, but who knows? But the news is basically that nobody knows what the hell is going on with the rare earths, which is military and civil use, and that anyway the paperwork needed to get these exports, and that's the problem. It's the blockage of the bureaucracy to get the permission to export. So that is the problem at the moment, and probably the ministry that deals with this is dealing with all this paper coming in and they can't keep up. So they haven't banned these things, it's just restricted. So what does this mean? None of you, except maybe Chris, old enough to remember the 1970s oil embargoes. That was a crisis. I was learning to drive then. And there were 50-mile-an-hour limits, there was petrol rationing, we were on 3-day weeks, and Jesus, it was a different world. Well, maybe we get back to that. So, you stopped sending oil or gas 2 winters ago, Russian gas, prices go up. It's an immediate political and economic crisis, okay? With this stuff, it's not. It's slow burning, So you're not going to go home and your mother-in-law is not going to say, oh Christ, I got no rare earths. No. But it's there. It's in the economy, it's in the clean energy supply chain, it's in the military, it's whatever. Governments worry about it. People will only start to worry about it further down the lane. So it's not today's low politics, it's high politics. So that's the first thing to realise. So what are we all trying to do about it? Now, Japan actually did, after 2010, start to do something. They got involved in a rare earth mine in Australia, for example. They tried to do something in Vietnam, but I don't think anything happened. They tried to do something in Kazakhstan, but it didn't work out. But they tried. Everybody else, as Sophia said, fell asleep. Until 2022, we had the US Inflation Act, which supported all sorts of wonderful stuff along the supply chains. The EU had a Critical Materials Act in 2024. Mineral-rich countries like Australia and Canada saw opportunities to produce more of this stuff and process it and sell it to us in the non-mineral bearing countries. And the US created a mineral security partnership in 2022 to bring countries together to try and do stuff. So the aim is to increase investment in production of ores, processing, and supporting innovation in these supply chains. So the question, and this is the last bit in my talk, what is the likely effectiveness of these measures? I would bet my pension on it. I might bet yours. In fact, you younger people might have to bet your pension may be linked to this. Okay, let's start with mines. I'm a geologist, okay? So it takes time and capital to open a new mine, even in the best of times. If you're trying to do it in a relatively well-governed country, even the US, it can take a long time because indigenous people, local people will stand up against it, okay? And there's a rare earth deposit discovered in Sweden. The Sami indigenous people are there with their reindeer. It may never happen. In Serbia, they're demonstrating against a possible rare earth mine. So, yeah, I mean, and there's a rare earth mine being developed in Brazil, hopefully very cleanly. So the social license to operate is important, but also the money. One of the problems with many of these minerals is that the big companies, the Rio Tintos, etc., are not interested. It's too small. The amount is too small. These are not billion-dollar profit activities. So you need small and medium-sized companies to do it. Yeah, they need to go and get people to lend them money, okay, or governments. Yeah. So the big guys, I mean, Rio Tinto is moving into lithium. Lithium's quite big scale, but some of this stuff is not big. Processing, in principle, it could be quicker to build a processing plant, but many of them are toxic and they often use lots of energy and water. Manufacturing is actually challenging. I mean, we've had there was going to be a factory in northeast England. They gave up, but that was probably business management. Northvolt in Sweden was set up and has essentially failed because of too much ambition, but failure to manage the safety and the technology, internal processing problems. And they're bankrupted early this year. Innovation, you can say, oh yeah, we innovate new stuff. It doesn't need all this shit. Okay, but China's already doing it. It's probably ahead of you. And will do it cheaper. Also, if you start a mine, as they've done in Mountain Pass in California many years ago to produce rare earths, China can then, intentionally or unintentionally, flood the market with rare earths, the price goes down, the mine closes. It's now operating and processing because the Department of Defense is subsidizing it. And many projects in the US, mining and processing, etc., have been delayed because stuff is difficult. The economics, commerciality is difficult. So, what's the outlook? Things are happening. But is that enough to make a difference in the next 10 years to all of this? I don't think so. Maybe not in 20 years, but certainly not in 10 years. and that's even with government support. And which governments have lots of money to spend? China. Yes. Can't think of any others. So I will stop there. I sort of addressed the question that Sophia left, that how successful are we likely to be? And the answer is not much successful unless this is real cooperation among industrialized nations with the nations that have the resources, but also innovation, but it needs money, 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 money. I will stop there.
Thank you very much. We're going to reassume our seats at the front. And just wanted to pose one or two, thank you, questions, and then turn it over to those of you in the audience with questions. And I wanted to ask, it's a very simple question, actually. What's so bad about China having a monopoly in this area? I mean, the assumption is is always negative here. We're reading it from a particular country perspective. Globalization until recently was sufficient to deliver a steady supply of these products. Is it inherent? What are we saying by pointing to by criticizing this situation, which not that long ago would have passed the test of secure?
Well, it's the risks. The risk of disruption of supply chain. And as I said, it could be unintentional. You know, COVID. Try buying a computer during COVID, yeah? Very difficult. I tried. Took a long time. So unintentional stuff. And then I suppose I pass it to Sophia. It's the geopolitics that have screwed this up in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's not good to have a monopoly of anything.
Yeah.
It's great. I mean, to sort of to have access is really important, and we did. I mean, with rare earths in particular, it was profound how much industrial nations did not understand that these were very important materials for nanotechnologies, for efficient magnets and wind turbines. It was just staggering, and the reality was that it's the geopolitics. I mean, as we saw, people really thought that everything was, everybody was making money and it wasn't a problem. But once it became clear that becoming an important economic power also had political influence, it challenged global institutions. I mean, China said, okay, China is not exporting its political system, but it does want to have a say in global international institutions and other countries, not only China, other countries like India or other emerging countries, nations like Brazil. They want to have a say in institutions that were created after World War II and represented the preferences of the victors of the war. So they really wanted to create standards. They wanted to bring in their own interests. So that's, I think, how politics got so involved, got so mixed up with trade. Although I have to say that this concept that the economy is somehow apolitical is also a fantasy. It was never. But I think that industry really wanted us to believe that they're two separate things.
But I think when this has been, as you said, this has been a trend for some time. In 2010, 2012, I did an EU project on access to oil, gas, and minerals. And Kobe van der Linde, she's an energy political economist in Holland. She drew this diagram, four-quadrant diagram with cooperation versus competition, state versus market-oriented world. And she said, okay, we're here now, we're cooperating in markets, but we're going to move to the fragmented, state-controlled, non-cooperative. And she was dead right, and this was 13 years ago. And we've moved there.
Exactly, and I mean, I think this is why I mentioned that industrial policy, for example, was an anathema. This idea that it could be, the state can decide which technology will be successful or will not be successful. It's the market that would decide. And countries in Asia showed, Korea did it, Japan did it, other countries did that, and China definitely did that. They decided that in order to really catch up and leapfrog, I mean, for China specifically, this is what really happened. There was no way that China could produce automobiles and be as competitive as the European and the American car industry. So when it became clear that because of climate, the next technology is going to be the electrification of transport, they saw an opportunity to dominate an area when Europe was producing diesel and America was producing gas guzzling SUVs. And so they saw where it was going. This is why I mentioned that after 2015, it became very clear that the global consensus was to reduce emissions, and the electrification of transport took precedence. And the reality was that China found this opportunity, and it really honed in. And it made sure that it was ready and able. And it scaled to build the clusters. I mean, it's not as if it didn't subsidize. Nobody's claiming that they played fair in the sense of, WTO speak. But the reality is that they got to where they wanted to be. They also, I think, realized that geopolitically, at some point, their competitors were going to decide that China is too big now and too important and too crucial and playing too much of a role. And their fear was that they will be encircled, that they will try to decelerate the progress, which is also very problematic, especially in a country that has one government, one party rule, and everything great that happens is a success for the party, but if anything goes wrong, it's also, you can't vote them out of office. So they have to take all the blame, and they reap both the benefits, but also the issues. So I think thinking ahead, they realized that at some point, people were going to wake up to the fact that, China's like 3 times the US, 4, in terms of population size. So I think that they were preparing for that eventuality as well, which is why they wanted to do the dual circulation economy. They made the Made in China project, where they wanted to ensure that if somebody wants to cut them off, if the rest of the industrial nations want to cut them off or limit them, they will be far ahead enough to not really suffer. It was planned ahead.
Well, what's interesting, just a brief, is that the 2 big battery manufacturers, CATL and BYD, were all started by individual entrepreneurs.
Because they're
state, going back to the late 90s, 20, 25 years.
And one of the phenomenal things about China is how cutthroat the entrepreneurial world is, because it's super competitive. People who are very hardworking. I mean, there's a narrative. Look, the reality is, as I said, you can compete with China and maybe not like what China's doing, but also to misrepresent what's happening there is not at all helping the case. Because if you have wrong information about why China succeeded, then you make wrong decisions domestically. So we need to really understand. So this thing that you just mentioned, the entrepreneurial spirit, the fact that this wasn't, Xi Jinping didn't come up with the idea of, let's create this. No, there were people really competing to the death in order to capture the market. And so much innovation, this idea that somehow China doesn't innovate, but it copies everything. This is a 20-year-old conversation. This should not be happening in the 21st century. We need to really understand where China's been innovative and how to respond to that accordingly.
Can we go back, because if this is the beginning, the point of origin of assuming using an industrial policy and using the tools they have, so hothouse and take the opportunity, the green economy, and go and run with it. In this era that we're currently in, where economic tools, economic statecraft, finance is weaponized, tariffs are tossed around, have we so globalized all economic areas at this stage that there's the space for cooperation to re-engage with supply chains is no longer available, or at least damaged such that you can't trust other
I mean, is the glass half empty or half full?
I'm sorry, I don't.
just
I'm a geologist. Put it
Yeah.
in 4-letter words.
Okay. No, economic statecraft works once,
Yes.
right? Trump says
Yeah.
a tariff. The first time it works.
Yeah.
But the second time, the third time, what have you, you scale it up, you move it across different domains, it becomes less and less effective. They begin to price in the risk.
Yeah.
And in pricing in risk, the utility of economic statecraft diminishes, and it has an effect on the system at large. And I wonder what you think about particularly the new political economy of supply against this changing environment.
So I think there's always been this idea that economic statecraft, all the kinds of economic disruptions, embargoes, tariffs, all these things, twisting everybody's arm financially. I mean, how many times have we penalized countries? We've penalized Russia for Ukraine. We've
South
penalized
Africa.
Iran. I mean, just the more recent. So this economic statecraft has been used extensively by the West, but not only. And it's definitely, let's say, it has diminishing returns. And it is problematic in the long term because you can only use it, I mean, things correct themselves. So for example, there are all these tariffs that were placed on everybody, and China got 147%. Well, China is already producing in other countries. They just took off the Chinese from the labels, and Vietnam may have now 20% tariff or 30% tariff. They're rerouting things. Like, you can't stop water from flowing. So I definitely think that this kind of statecraft is not going to, this kind of confrontational logic is not going to work for very long. The question is, how will supply chains be reconfigured? We're going to have a lot of, they won't be as economically efficient as they were before, because they're going to be replicated in order to say, okay, now we have a problem with this jurisdiction, let's use this other alternate supply chain. So even big companies, that run trade, cargo around the world, because it's sort of like a bus lane, everything goes through shipping, they're trying to figure out the routes too, based on all of these kinds of economic changes.
Let's turn it all the way around. Look from China's point of view, okay? They've got these tools. They can make life very uncomfortable for industrialized nations. And as I think we agree, in the next 10 years, we're not going to do anything about it. So they can keep restricting, banning, if they don't like what we do. The question is, what does, China used to buy lots of food products from the US. Now it'll buy it from Brazil, more like that. So I think, does China have, in this context, more cards to play than the West? Because as you said, it's trying to, not so much with oil, but it's got friends it can buy oil from, and gas, Russia, second gas pipeline maybe. So is China actually have more cards in economic statecraft than the industrialized nations combined?
Well, I think that they have the privilege of not having to change government every so often. And voters are very impatient. The government's worried that if they don't show progress in the next year, they'll be out of office. I mean, people sense that something's wrong, but there's not enough appetite for long-term thinking, whereas they can afford to have that long-term thinking. I think the system is way too interconnected. Nobody's going to be, super successful, whereas everybody else crashes. And I'm talking about the major industrial players, but certainly China can wait it out longer. it doesn't also mean, I mean, even the fact that we're talking about it in this way shows that we are in the wrong mindset. It's very confrontational because we've been so steeped in this conversation for so long of thinking that this is all coming to a head, that, you know, once you've broken these ties of interdependence, it's hard, you've weaponized everything, then it becomes hard to rebuild trust. But I do think that there are many, you know, the world is trading with China. And, you know, they're very dependent on China. And more importantly, I think it's not even what China's doing, is the fact that there's no investment, that nobody wants it, everything's come to a standstill. And with respect to the United States, like, nobody's gonna go invest in the United States now to offset what's happening in China, because they're not entirely sure if things are gonna change tomorrow. So everyone's kind of like sitting here, nothing's happening. Like, it's come to a standstill, and that could weaken the position of the US.
Because, I mean, coming to this fact that the Communist Party doesn't have to be re-elected, Zedong, am I correct? Somebody told me that on Monday or the weekend there was an article in one of the Chinese domestic newspapers saying that we all have to tighten our belts and cool. Is that correct? Yes. So the government is already preparing the population for tough times. Yeah.
This is on the basis of the tariff, the actual
Well, and
hitting the tariffs
and everything,
more general.
everything,
And
all
it's
the
part
shit
of
out
the
there.
whole nationalist narrative of, you know, we're facing an external threat.
So, all of you have been very patient. Some questions, and if you do ask, or when you do ask, please identify yourselves. Yeah,
I have a question. My name is.
speak a little louder, please. Do we have a mic? No. Just broadcast loud, anyway.
Yeah, I can speak louder. That's okay. I'm Anaïs Guillonvin. I'm a sustainability analyst at a battery supply chain due diligence startup. And so the statement and the idea that we have to collaborate with China, that is crucial. And it's a statement that I think also applies very much to the market currently. And that's what we're seeing right now as well. Thank you. I'm just wondering, so in terms of the supply chain there and the production of batteries, et cetera, the implications for ESG, I'm especially thinking of the Xinjiang region in China and the production of PVs, et cetera, does lead to a lot of issues such as forced labor. And I'm wondering what should the ESG price be essentially for the green economy? Or to put it in other words, how much are we willing to sacrifice in terms of environment, in terms of social issues mostly, to be able to reach this green economy, a decarbonized economy?
I mean, I'll say, I think that, what's the LME, London Metal Exchange, I think they, or certainly people around it, were discussing, you know, say with nickel, should there be two types of nickel, you know, good nickel and bad nickel, and that people should pay a higher price for good nickel, okay, clean, properly developed and processed nickel, ESG and all of that. So the debate is out there that I know, but that then immediately, I mean, you mentioned the European ESG standards, but that gives a real problem. You know, if you're digging out cobalt in DRC, who is going to certify that your cobalt has come from a good cobalt mine or having been processed wherever? I mean, diamonds, I mean, you've got...
Kimberley process was
yeah, I mean, that's all right. That Kimberley diamond's probably easier to trace, yeah, because there are relatively few big mines, you know, you just dig it out and you cut it, but you don't process it any further. But in principle it's there, but it would need a very strong bureaucracy and willing participation of the host countries. So the principle is there, and has been discussed. I haven't followed it. Have you followed this
Okay,
debate?
so I think that there, again, it's sort of one of these false dilemmas. When, you know, the green transition is very materially intensive, but everything we're doing industrially is materially intensive. It's like, why demonize the green transition specifically for being so materially intensive? Or to be less, let's say, have a bigger social impact. That does not mean that we shouldn't, I think the idea was setting standards is good for two reasons. Number one, because we should have standards, like environmental standards, social standards. And these are things that, let's say, the European Union and I want to say the West more broadly was, it was part of the whole ethos that we need to protect human rights and that we shouldn't allow for dirty, conflict diamonds or whatever. So these kinds of, reinforcing these norms and values has been part of the Western, let's say, narrative, and how successfully we've done that, but there are ways to do it. I do think that it's also convenient and useful because setting these kinds of standards is also levels the playing field. So this could be applying different kinds of standards, like ESG standards, or I'll stick to ESG standards. ESG standards also means that China, for instance, will need to comply, because this is about financing. How will you, what kinds of rates will your project be able to get financing unless you're complying with these standards? So I definitely think that there is the right thing to do, and this is where Europe is very useful. I mean, they'll kill you with bureaucracy, but they're a huge regulatory power, and they've been great standard setters. And so I've always argued that I think that the European Union, I mean, with ESG, for example, the European Union has the most advanced standards. There's not a uniform consensus yet, but definitely Europe is pushing, and it has convening power, and it has this regulatory power. And it also is a partner in the developing world in ways that the United States, for instance, had gone away. I mean, the United States left Africa for real after the end of the Cold War, really. The Europeans, maintained the relationship. I mean, they do have baggage, but they did maintain a very active relationship, for good or for bad, in Africa. And I think that they do have a seat at the table, and they have strong partnerships. And given the fact that the developing nations would also prefer not to become these geographies of extraction, they want to move up the value chain. It is also in their interest, and they have much more agency now. It is also, not all in the same way. Some may not cooperate, some may really want to do this. So I definitely think this is an ongoing dialogue, and but we need to prioritize it versus taking a transactional approach, which is what the US is now proposing.
I think there are two things here. Right, you're right. The key, because I remember when I used to teach at the University of Dundee, a developing country, and they'd say, oh, the international companies are horrible. And I'd say, no, it's your governments that are idle. Yeah, not enforcing regulation. I mean, it's both, but it's not enforcing regulations.
Remember, industry doesn't like regulation.
I know. So I'm being exaggerating. But I think when it comes to the Chinese, because I did a short policy brief when I was in Singapore, greening the Belt and Road, okay? And so I looked at how many of Chinese banks are involved in, I forget, there's an organization of banks that tries to do good things. There were 2 banks, I'd never heard of them, local banks. So this is not where the money is coming from the Belt and Road. And then there's oil and gas and resource companies have some other sort of green association. Very few Chinese companies involved in those, only the top 2 or 3 oil companies, not the mining companies. So stuff coming from mining, from China, for mining and processing, it doesn't need foreign money, it takes Chinese money, etc., etc. And although the greening of the Belt and Road is happening with respect to power generation, generally, no more coal-fired power plants, except if they're captive plants related to processing of minerals in Indonesia, then they are coal-fired. So I haven't seen any direct efforts by the Chinese government to really push down on their companies in mining to make sure that they are not only obeying the local regulations, but maybe exceeding the local regulations.
You know what, you know what always struck me about China operating in these resource extraction zones or setting up processing, that the standards that at least were on the books in parts of Africa and other Asia, Latin America, were actually higher than Chinese domestic standards. And so unlike the usual model is Europe, North America, or what have you, has a higher standard, at least in domestic operations, which they then translate into, or is perhaps the direction of travel is easier. You would think if at home you do it this way, you've developed it. Whereas for China, they had to reach up higher than their own domestic conditions.
Yeah, they're behaving like they do at home. Yeah, precisely.
So it was a different, well, I mean, they are, but that in order to achieve, if they went by the book, they could open a mine in Zambia.
Yeah.
And the book actually is pretty clear on labor standards and the like. So they'd have to be a better company than they were back in China.
Yeah.
That's what I meant with that.
Yeah.
And that's a big ask, actually, of companies and industry that come out of competitive
I mean, I want to
environments.
say something, that mining has never been, the most, it's a business that has a footprint, let me put it diplomatically. And, this is why they're developing all of these smart mining reports and how to do it better and how to be more transparent as to the kinds of energy and water use, the impacts on ecosystems and local people. So, I mean, it's one of those, this is why nobody wants to mine in Europe. We can't open a hole in Europe, it's impossible, because nobody likes it. And it's very, it's controversial. But the reality is, we do need materials, and all attention now is turning to mining. So definitely, I mean, up until recent, now there's so much noise, we don't know what anybody's doing. But the reality is that mining companies, up until just now, had really been spotlighted, and they did have to improve standards. And there was a lot of really good work coming out of their own associations, but also of many, the World Bank. I mean, there were many institutions that were coming out and saying how to improve practices. But as I said, it's, our entire civilization is completely materially and energy intensive, and we really have not been able to crack the code. I mean, just showing your slides when we're saying, China has 18%, I don't know, of renewables, or 40% or 20 or 30%. We're like, well, that's not enough. Well, that's a lot more than most other countries. And they, but they're still using coal. Well, that's because the entire economic projection is we're going to be more people who need more energy. Nobody's making a projection by saying we're going to be more people, but because of the climate crisis, we're going to cut energy by 30%. We're cutting emissions. We're not cutting inputs. So really, I mean, but we can't figure out how to do this differently. I mean, we're sort of trapped in this growth model that we can't, now we're trying to do more with fewer emissions.
But the only thing that's different between metals and energy, oil, gas and coal, is the recycling. Okay, so that's something to look forward to, meaning we can't do much today because there's not much to recycle yet. But come back in 20 years' time, and there will be a huge recycling business,
Sure.
and that's something to look forward to. Yeah.
Other questions out there? Let's start over here.
God,
I think I'm
time
okay.
is fleeting, shouldn't it? Give shorter answers. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Simran. I work in management consultancy, but I'm a student here.
You have to speak, you will have to speak a bit louder.
I'm a student here with Professor Alden at the LSE as well.
My question is for states, emerging economies, for example, India, Brazil, who are looking to, let's say, develop their semiconductor industry. I read in the news recently that India is trying to develop that industry. Where do they play in this US-China geopolitical battle? Is there a scenario where there's opportunity for them to almost make the most of, buying sort of critical minerals from China, but not facing the wrath of the US as a result of that? Is there opportunity, or are there more challenges if you're trying to get into this industry?
Okay, well, let's put it this way. It's, it depends on how things are gonna go. Because at the moment, this battle that's happening is really an effort from the United States to say you're either doing it with us and against the others, or you're not coming, you can't have access to our economy. But I want to say for chips, semiconductors, all these, even under Biden, the United States was really twisting the arm of its allies. So with Japan, it really wanted Japan to not sell certain technologies to China. In South Korea, there was this tremendous push to stop selling to China and come and build foundries in the United States that they wanted the Koreans to pay for themselves. So there is, there's been a lot of arm twisting. I think, if we believe in this reality that's happening, as I said, there are many pathways. We don't it's not one way. Like, we can go this way and say, okay, the world's gonna divide, but the world does not wanna divide because they're making money by selling and trading with different partners. Nobody wants to go back to, the Cold War and a bipolar world. There's a lot of pushback against that. But it's going to be a little bit touch and go now. We saw that just recently in the Gulf. The whole conversation in the UAE was about really gaining access to chips. They had been put in the second tier of, security. Why? Because, I don't know, they're trading with China. And they managed to really regain access to the market, to American technology. So we're going to see. I think, India, for instance, has been trying, it had been improving its relations with China. Now, of course, after Kashmir, there's like a lot of distress. But Modi has also been trying to really cozy up with the United States so that iPhones, instead of being produced in China, will now be produced in India. So, people are going to try, countries are going to try to play all sides. What they really want to do now is really get a hold of, they want to get in the game, especially with chips. AI, everybody wants to do sovereign AI, people are building data centers. There's such a rush to get part of this market that they're going to figure out the details as they go along. And nobody wants to be shut out of the US, nobody wants to be shut out of China. They're going to have to figure this out.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm Will, I'm a financial analyst. Look, a lot of renewable players are projecting that even. Thank you.
This is not working. Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of renewable players are projecting that even despite political shifts away from renewables in the US, that they'll actually be one of the most strategic developmental sort of areas for the US given the increasing demand and the speed of implementation and expansion. Given the amount that China produces, do you think that could pose a threat to the US? Do you think there could be some geopolitical risk in the area? And do you think it's entirely feasible that the US could expand its production in the area fast enough to make up for that?
Expand the production of...
Renewable resources like solar panels, but turbines.
Okay, all
maybe not the materials, but...
Okay. The key, I think, is commerciality. You know, you can produce anything. At what cost? And will the Chinese undermine it, or will there be tariffs so large to protect, or will there be sufficient government support to protect? Okay, and from what I can see, and Sophia will know more, but not being in America, Trump is not protecting renewable energy equipment. Yeah, he's maybe protecting the minerals and metals that are needed for certain industries, particularly defense and technology, IT technology, etc. I don't think he's particularly seeking to protect the renewable energy sector as Biden was.
So I definitely, okay, so a couple of things. First of all, the United States has a federal system. So a lot of the states, like Texas, for instance, is like, it's such a cool state. I mean, they do like all the fossil, but they're leaders in renewables. Who would have thought? And so I think...
Are they making it? Are they, they're installing it?
They're installing it, they're...
Okay.
So, all by way of saying that there are a lot of... So the narrative has changed. I mean, even the dismantling of the IRA, they're dismantling the climate framework. But because a lot of the investments were going to red states, there's a tremendous push by Republicans to maintain certain subsidies and benefits to these states. So the United States will probably continue if it makes economic sense to build its momentum. Where it's really going to suffer is in the electrification of transport. Because with the exception of Tesla, which is not popular right now, the rest of the companies are really unable to produce cars that they're not losing money on. But why I'm insisting, and so there's a big problem there. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to play out. But Tesla is not going to fight this battle because they already are the leader. I mean, Tesla sells like 1.5 million cars globally. I mean, BMW sells 1.75 globally, just BMW. So I know it's like the thing, but it's not the size. I mean, the capitalization, the worth of the company is much higher than the size because it's like a tech company. It was an American company. I definitely think that this is going to be a problem for the United States, the electrification of transport. But in terms of renewables, I think that there's enough investment and expertise now that they will continue to deploy, but it will not be a focus for the government. It's not going to be in like a goal of the government to do that.
But they will still need the metals inputs.
Sure.
Unless they go perovskite, which is, but yeah, so they still need China somewhere.
But the reality is, a lot of this is talk. I mean, they can't refine, they cannot, even MP Materials has been refining their rare earths in China.
Yeah, it's a tiny amount, yeah.
they also really, now they came out with a huge announcement saying, oh, they're talking to the Saudi mining company after the trip to explore the possibility of doing refining in Saudi Arabia. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be a pensioner by the time any of this all occurs. I mean, these things are not, I snap my fingers and it happens the next day. So, and China, I mean, the other thing I want to say about China, because you talked a lot about what China's doing. I mean, China was a rare earth exporter, now it's a rare earth importer. It's using all of its own materials. It's not like only that it doesn't want to export. It actually needs the stuff domestically, and it's importing so much from Vietnam.
Yeah. And
anywhere else.
Myanmar.
And Myanmar.
Yeah.
Because those are readily available to them.
Yeah.
And so it's not even that they want to boycott exports. It's just that they actually, and they've given the world notice. They had given the world notice that they want it for domestic consumption because they do produce the magnets, they do produce the electric vehicles. They need these materials. So it's not only going to be restrictions or bans, and I think in the end there will continue to be trading, but there's going to be replication of supply chains in order to avoid the harder.
It's interesting, the examples you gave, though, were focusing on neighbors. I mean, the idea of nearshoring as a reconfiguration of the supply chain,
And
supply lines.
Indonesia nickel.
Yes, yeah, so all of these things, I think, are behind it, the larger shape of the international economy seems to be going that direction in logic.
It was, except how is this going to happen now if the United States pits itself against everybody? I mean, that was the Biden plan. It was to friendshore and nearshore and onshore. Like any combination was fine, as long as we did it with our friends and allies, just to make sure that we don't get cut off. Now, I don't know how that's going to work. It's a very, we should not get sucked in though. I mean, I think that Europe, and good to go back to that, I mean, people in America, if I ever say that, if I ever say a good word about China, it's like, why are you saying a good word about China? Like nobody, it's not like I'm championing China. I'm just saying, this is the reality. We all gotta make a living here and we gotta make this work. So, for years I've been saying that either Europe and China need to really work together more closely. I mean, they have a strategic partnership. This doesn't mean that Europe needs to change its political system, or that Europe needs to accept to be flooded, or that it doesn't need to have its own standards and terms for trade. And Europe never turned against China in the way that the United States did. It spoke about resilience, about diversification. But when CATL wanted to come into Europe and build a plant, they're like, okay, come on in. It wasn't this thing of, because Europe doesn't want to be, can't be, doesn't want to be, it's not the MO to be the part of this bipolar superpower structure. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for Europe to keep everybody, I mean, obviously I'm biased, perspective, because they're such standard setters and they're regulatory and they have, as I said before, they have convening power. And I definitely think that Europe could really serve through critical minerals diplomacy to bring China into these wider conversations. It doesn't mean that China is going to necessarily comply with everything Europe may be proposing, but they've done so much work together for taxonomy, green taxonomy, for financing, for instance. I mean, they've been on board, and I definitely see that there's room for cooperation. But if you say that, then it's like, oh, it's the betrayal of the transatlantic partnership. Well, right now it's in shambles. So
Why not? Yeah, okay.
you respect it. Yeah.
I think we've gone to time and just over. Is there any last question out there that we didn't get a chance, or do you can come forward and speak to the speakers directly then? Thank you very much for a very lively exchange here, and
you.
really as much, I certainly learned a lot, I'm sure everyone else did, so thank our speakers, please. Yes, you say it.
If anyone's got one of these in front of them or can find one, please give us your feedback.